Have you ever noticed someone who has very few close friends, no big social groups, no need to be surrounded by people at all times, just a small, tight circle they truly trust? Most people look at them and assume they're antisocial, maybe lonely, maybe broken in some way. But psychology tells a completely different story, because that small circle isn't a limitation. It isn't a flaw. It is a deliberate, conscious choice made by some of the most emotionally intelligent, self-aware, and psychologically grounded people on the planet. We're going to break down 8 psychological reasons why today. And I'll warn you, some of these will genuinely surprise you. But stay with me until the end, because in the final minute, I'm going to reveal one psychological sign that proves whether this is actually you. You won't want to miss that. Let's decode the real psychology behind people who keep their circles small. And by the end of this, you might realize this has been describing you all along. Point 1. They choose depth over breadth. Let's start with something called Dunbar's number. British psychologist Robin Dunbar discovered that the human brain has a biological limit. We can only maintain around 150 stable social relationships at any given time. And within that, only about 5 people can ever occupy our innermost circle. Just 5. People who keep small circles have, consciously or not, respected this limit their entire lives. They don't spread their emotional energy across dozens of shallow connections. They invest everything into a few. And research consistently confirms that the quality of your relationships, not the quantity, is the single strongest predictor of happiness, mental health, and even how long you live. These people aren't missing out on anything. They simply figured out something most people spend their whole lives trying to learn. But number 2, this is where it gets really interesting. Point 2. They protect their energy fiercely. People with small circles have almost always been burned before. Betrayal, fake loyalty, one-sided friendships, where they gave everything and received almost nothing back. And rather than becoming bitter, they became selective. Psychologists call this interpersonal selectivity, a conscious filtering process where a person raises their standards for who gets close access to them. This isn't coldness. This isn't arrogance. This is wisdom earned through experience. Because they've learned something painful but important. The wrong people in your inner circle don't just waste your time. They quietly drain your confidence, distort your self-image, and slow your growth. So they protect that inner space. Carefully, deliberately, without apology. Now, number 3. This one flips what most people believe. Point 3. They love differently and more deeply. Here is something that genuinely surprises most people. The smaller someone's circle, the more intensely they tend to love the people inside it. Psychology research on attachment theory shows that selective people often form secure, stable, deeply committed bonds. They show up completely. They remember the small details most people forget. They check on you without being asked. They protect your reputation when you're not in the room. They stay when things get hard, instead of disappearing when life gets inconvenient. If someone with a small circle calls you a close friend, understand what that means. That is not a title they hand out freely. That is one of the rarest things you can earn from another human being. We're halfway through, and the next 4 points are the deeper ones. Keep watching. Point 4. They are deeply self-aware. Keeping a small circle requires something many people struggle with: the ability to sit comfortably alone with yourself. To not need noise. To not need constant stimulation just to feel okay. People who don't require a large group to feel validated often have a stable self-concept, a clear sense of who they are, their values, their boundaries, their non-negotiables. They don't collect friendships to fill a void. They don't need an audience to feel significant. And that kind of self-awareness is powerful. Number 5. This one hits close to home for many people. Point 5. They see through fake connections. Social media has convinced many people that the goal is to have as many followers and friends as possible. But psychologists warn about social overload, the exhaustion that builds when you maintain too many shallow relationships. People with small circles either experienced this burnout or avoided it early. They've learned the difference between people who are there for the good times and those who are there for all times. The hard ones, the quiet ones, the moments when you have nothing impressive to show. They would rather have one person who truly knows them than 100 who only know their performance. You may want to save this video, because number 6 and 7 hit differently the second time. Point 6. They have mastered being alone. There is a crucial difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is painful. It is disconnection against your will. But solitude is a choice. It is the ability to be alone and feel completely whole. People who keep small circles often develop this naturally. They recharge in silence. They think more clearly without noise. They don't confuse being alone with being unwanted. And that changes how they move through the world, with calmness, groundedness, and quiet confidence. Now, number 7. This one surprises almost everyone. Point 7. They are harder to manipulate. People with small, selective circles are statistically harder to manipulate socially and emotionally. And here's why. Manipulation thrives on two things: the need for approval and the fear of exclusion. If you desperately need to be liked, you become vulnerable. You bend your values to fit in. You suppress your real opinions to keep the peace. But people who chose a small circle have made peace with not being universally liked. So outside pressure has very little power over them. And that kind of freedom is priceless. And finally, number 8. Point 8. They often achieve more. Maintaining a large social network is expensive, cognitively. Every relationship requires mental bandwidth, remembering details, managing dynamics, navigating conflicts. People with small circles often carry lower social cognitive load, and that freed up energy goes somewhere, into their work, their goals, their craft, their growth. They understand that where your attention goes, your results follow. Every person removed from your inner circle who doesn't belong there creates space for something that does. And I promised you one sign that proves whether this is you. Here it is. If you watched this entire video and felt like someone was finally describing you accurately, that feeling itself is the sign. Because people who don't keep small circles rarely search for content like this. But you did. You stayed. You listened. And that level of self-reflection is exactly what we've been talking about. That's not a coincidence. That's just who you are. So if you keep a small circle, hear this clearly. You are not antisocial. You are not cold. You are not broken. You've simply learned one of life's most underrated lessons. That real connection is rare. That your energy is valuable. That the right few will always be worth more than the wrong many. You don't need a crowd to feel full. You never did. And that isn't loneliness. That is wisdom. If you want to understand the hidden psychology behind human behavior, subscribe now. Because on this channel, we don't just observe people, we decode them.